Right, well, my name is Reg Charles. I was born on the 1st of February 1923, and that was in a small village about 6 miles north of Banbury. After that, we moved to several different villages, and when the war started in 1939, I'd already started work. I started work in January 1939, and in 1941, I decided that I should be doing something in the war effort and joined the Auxiliary Fire Service. I thought that I would go into the Auxiliary Fire Service on a full-time basis instead of going into any of the other services. But the only thing that was offered me was a dispatch rider in London. I didn't ride a motorbike. I didn't know London, so I didn't feel inclined to stay in the fire service. So I just left it alone, and in I think it was November 1941, I had call-up papers to tell me to go to a medical examination in Oxford. I went for my medical at the beginning of December. That was quite amusing in a way. A fellow in front of me hobbled into the medical room, and on his way in he looked at me and he says, "In no way can they make me A1. He said, "I've got one leg shorter than the other." Well, when he came out, I said, "How did you get on?" "Oh, I'm A1, he said. "They tell me that where you're going, the ground isn't level." So I think anyone in those days, as long as you could breathe, you were A1. They were so anxious to get men into the services. Well, at the end of December 1941, I received my call-up papers to report to Cowley Barracks in Oxford to join the Oxford and Bucks Light Infantry. A bit before I went up to Cowley Barracks, I thought, well, knowing full well that you should have a very short hair going into the army. And I went to a barber shop in the town of Banbury and told him I was on my way to Oxford to be called up. Would he give me a very short back and sides, which of course I had. Well, when I arrived in Oxford, where all the new recruits were on a parade, there was about 30 of us, and the officer examining us walked along the front row first of all and had a few words to say. Then he walked behind us, and fellows had to keep on leaving. They were all going to have their haircuts. And I thought, well, I should be all right because I've had one haircut this morning. But lo and behold, when the officer got to me, he punched me in the back and he said, "Did you feel that?" I says, "Yes." He said, "Well, go and get your haircut. I'm standing on it." So I had 2 haircuts in one day. I think that's quite a record. The training we did at Oxford was being trained to be a light infantryman. I suppose the main training really was to kill. Soon after being in the barracks there, a certain officer came into my knowledge. His name was Captain Malcolm Spokes. I kept out of his clutches as much as possible, and lo and behold, in 1953, I met him again. That was 11 years later. And this time, I was accompanying his daughter, who in 1954 became my wife. And so I can say I met my father-in-law 11 years before I met my wife, which again is quite a record probably. Well, it was quite a shock to the system going from civil life into the army. But really, in those days, we didn't ever travel very far from home, and I hadn't lived with a number of men before, which was very strange. We were billeted in huts. I would think probably around about 40 of us in a hut. The first day, after having a haircut, we went into a big room, and we had a bugler. As you probably know, the light infantry, we had to answer to bugle calls, and we were told that we got to memorise these bugle calls. There was about 10 in all, and we had this bugler, and we were told that we could ask him to keep on playing different calls until we really knew what they were all about. Well, I think the only bugle call that we all knew and all welcomed was "Come to the cookhouse door, boys." And talking about the cookhouse, the food, I suppose really, we were very fortunate compared with the civilian population at that time. Our breakfast consisted mainly of porridge, which very often you really wanted a knife and fork and not a spoon. It was always very, very lumpy, but we survived, and at the meal tables, if anyone had got a complaint, all the officer would come round, but the sergeant with him would make sure that you couldn't complain. He told you immediately to sit down, and so complaints didn't get heard at all. Our training consisted mainly of a rifle practice on the rifle range, of throwing grenades behind we had a brick wall. We had to throw the grenades over the wall. We did a little bit of brand gun practice. We did quite a lot of parade drill on the parade ground. Very often that was to the accompaniment of the regimental band. Talking about the regimental band, we had a route march. I would think about every 10 days we would have a route march, consisting of about 20 miles, very often in full battle order, which was quite a load to carry, in addition to a rifle or even a brand gun. And the route march would take us always through the city of Oxford, and we were led through the city with the regimental band. We would go for about a 20-mile route march. When we got back to the edge of the city, the regimental band would be there again to meet us, and we would have to march back through the city behind the regimental band. And of course that encouraged us to march probably much smarter and quicker. Talking about the speed, the infantry, we used to have to march at 140 paces to the minute, which was pretty well running. Well, we used to go up on what they called Shotover Hill, which was a hill on the edge of Oxford, and there we used to have to dig slit trenches. A slit trench the trench about 4 by 2, 4 foot by 2 foot, and we would go down probably 3.5, 4 feet. And we felt that was a waste of time. But once we got into action in Normandy and other places, we soon learnt to dig and dig quick. In fact, we used to talk about the infantry having the 3 Ds. It was digging, dashing, and dodging. All 3 Ds were very important to us, and a spay was a very important part of the equipment. After we had 3 months training, roughly, at the barracks in Cayley Barracks, and I was very fortunate. I managed to get enlisted on a mechanical training course, and I had we went to Slade Camp, which was only about half a mile away from Slade, from the Cayley Barracks, and there I had about 2 months driving and maintaining vehicles, and that helped me through the biggest part of my army life. When that finished, I think it was the end of May 1942, I was posted over to Ireland, and my mechanical training course came in useful. I was handed a 1,500 weight lorry straight away, and I worked there with the 3-inch mortar group, and we were practicing with 3-inch mortars on the mountains in Ireland. Talking about the mountains in Ireland, most of the infantry lads there, they did a march once from our base, which was a place called Blackey, near Magherafelt, and they had 2 days to go to Coleraine up on the north coast. And when they finished, we drivers went to Coleraine and shipped them all back by lorry. Our officer in charge of the MT, he had his leg pulled about the MT drivers who never did any marching or anything, and he decided that we would do the same. And so we marched up to Coleraine over the mountain. Took 2 days. The whole trouble was, when we got there, we hadn't got any lorries to bring us back, and so we had to march back as well. So we had to do about 40 miles each in 2 days, both going and coming back, which wasn't much of a joke.
Cool.
What
about the uniform?
Uniform.
Webbing and the surgeon.
Yes. Well, of course, I think it was the second day when we were at the barracks. We went to the quartermaster sergeant's depot and fitted out with uniform. He just looked at us and handed a pair of trousers and a tunic, and he said that will fit you. And we had a khaki shirt and thick woolen socks and heavy boots. He did ask us the size for the boots, and when we got back into the barrack room, I think the first hour or two was spent changing the uniforms amongst ourselves, finding which fitted the best. But another thing which we didn't like about the uniform, it was virtually khaki with shades of white, and it was treated with some kind of gas proofing. But we found that that gradually got worn away, and especially if you got it wet, it soon went away then. But the army uniform was a little bit of a shock again to the system, because khaki was very rough and coarse. The khaki shirts were a bit rough on the skin, and everything that we had, it wasn't. It seemed old fashioned. We had leather braces and things like that, and it went a bit hard to begin with. Our civilian clothes, after about 2 weeks, we had those who were living within a fairly close distance of Oxford. We had a pass to take our civilian clothes back home, and I took mine home. And I remember the first thing my mother said to me, she says, "Reg, what have they done to your hair?" And of course, it wasn't there. The short back and the sides, it just left a little bit of a fringe, and that's all there was to it. Well, the waterproofing of vehicles, there again, I suppose, because I was connected with transport, and we had to. We did all our waterproofing of vehicles at Brightlingsea on the east coast. We sealed all the electrics and the intake, and we drove the vehicles onto landing craft, which would take us out a little way, and then we would drive them off the landing craft into about 5 foot, I would think, of water, up onto the beach, and we had to test to see how far we could drive them without them overheating, because with all the sealing, the engine overheated and it would seize. And we found that we could only cover about half a mile at the most before we had to rip off all the sealing of the electrics and the exhaust system. I met Major Howard, I think it would be February or March 1942, and he came to the K2 barracks, and he was getting his group together in readiness for the taking of Pegasus Bridge. He didn't tell us that at the time, but he told us that he was got to get men together for a special mission, and they would be going over to France in gliders. Well, I think at the time I thanked him for the opportunity, but I would much rather keep my feet on the ground, and so I stayed in the infantry and didn't join the gliders. The training in Oxford, it was pretty severe, because we were all new to army life. The training consisted chiefly of weapon training, rifles and bran guns, digging slit trenches, route marches, quite a lot of time was spent in the gymnasium, and it was all just to harden us up and make us more fit for the fight when it came. From Oxford, I went to Northern Ireland, joined the 5th Battalion of the Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. I was in Ireland for about 6 months, and then the battalion moved back into England. We were in various places in England, and while we were at Colchester, we went to Brightlingsea and did training ready for the invasion. In May of 1942, just before D-Day, the powers that be decided to disband the 5th Battalion, which I was with, and we were posted virtually all over the world, because we had, I think it was 9 battalions, and they were serving in various parts of the world. And at that time, I was in the motor transport stores, and instead of being posted away immediately, I was left behind to really clear up the stores and deliver the vehicles which we got on hand at the time. I spent quite a lot of time going backwards and forwards to a Central Ordnance Depot in Feltham with bits and pieces, and then we were delivering the vehicles to Burnham Beaches to be stored under the trees there. Well, during that time, D-Day happened, and eventually I was posted to the 4th Battalion, which were at that time in Lincolnshire. I had a few days in Lincolnshire with the 4th Battalion, and then came down to a holding unit at Aldershot, ready to go overseas. The 1st Battalion, which I was posted to, went into action in Normandy on June the 24th and the 25th. And I was posted to the 1st Battalion, which was already in action in Normandy. I was engaged in various battles in Normandy, and after the Falaise Gap and the taking of a village called Pierrefitte, we were reinforced again with our strength had dropped to pretty well 50%, and we had new recruits coming to reinforce, bring us up to battle strength again, and also fresh equipment. After Pierrefitte, we went through the Falaise Gap, which at that time, it was pretty awful. It was in August. The weather was very hot. There was dead animals and dead human beings everywhere, and the smell was pretty awful. Well, we marched on out of Normandy, went through northern France, and eventually arrived at Antwerp in Belgium. We were one side of the Albert Canal, and the Germans were the other. If we poked our heads around the corner, they would pot at us. If they poked their head round the corner of the building they were in, we likewise would pot at them. Well, after about 2 weeks, I would think, in Antwerp, we went into Holland, where we had the battle in the Normandy and Herzogenbosch. After Herzogenbosch and Normandy, we still stayed in Holland, mostly 1,500 weight vehicles. We had a few 3-tonners, chiefly Bedfords or Fords. We didn't waterproof any Bren gun carriers or anything. In fact, I didn't have anything to do with Bren gun carriers, although I did drive a Bren gun carrier for a very short time in Normandy, but I didn't do any Bren gun carrier driving while we were in England, and so I didn't have any experience of Bren gun carriers. The only thing that happened was soon after I got into Normandy, of course, all our letters home were censored, and I wrote a letter home saying that I felt like a square peg in a round hole, and the officer who was censoring the letters sent for me and asked me what I meant by that. And I told him that most of the time I've been in the army, I've been connected with transport, and now I was just a rifleman in a rifle company, and I just felt very much out of place. And he immediately turned around and said to me, he says, "Oh, would you like to drive a Bren gun carrier?" And I said, "Well, I never have done, but I'll certainly have a go." And I just drove a Bren gun carrier only for a few days, and a Bren gun carrier driver was sent as a reinforcement to the battalion, and of course he took over the Bren gun carrier, and I was back on foot again. But at times that was changed. Knowing that I could drive, I was driving various vehicles, chiefly jeeps, and did quite a little bit of casualty clearing while I was in Normandy, and I just went from one thing to another, driving a jeep, and then I will probably be back on foot again with the lads. And of course, when we were in action, like in the Reusswald Forest, well, we didn't have anything to drive there at all. In the Reusswald, I was with a very nice officer called Major Percy Hardeman, and I was with him when a shell dropped, and he bore the brunt of the shell, and he was killed. I was within about a couple of 100 yards of Lieutenant Colonel James Hare, who was the commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, and I actually saw him shot. And I have been to his grave, which is at East Beach in Holland, and I have been in communication with his daughter, who lives in Australia, and I've got the life story of James Hare, and likewise I keep in touch, or she keeps in touch with me, the daughter of Major Howard, who happens to be Penny Bates. Well, Market Garden, unfortunately, it wasn't a success. it was a landing by parachute. A lot of the fellows, they were shot in the air by the Germans. They didn't even land on the ground alive, and we were about, I would think, perhaps 8 or 10 miles away from Arnhem. That was the bridge that we were supposed to take, and we never actually got there in time, and so our involvement with Market Garden was far from a success, and it was all a very unfortunate happening. We did eventually go over Ardennes Bridge, but that was about a fortnight afterwards. Well, almost everywhere where we stayed, especially in Holland, most of the Dutch could speak English. And we had very little trouble in communicating with them. Most of the civilian places where we stayed happened to be in Holland. I can't remember a lot about Belgium, and of course we didn't stay in anywhere in Normandy, because we were either dug in ourselves, or at the best in a barn or farm buildings, and we just didn't have the opportunity of, it wasn't possible to live with the civilian population. While I was in the Ardennes, I'd had a promotion to be the company clerk, and we took over. It was an old pumping station in a place called Marsh. We were about 10 feet under the ground. To get into it, you went down a ladder which was fixed to the wall. It was bitterly cold there, but it was better than being out in the snow and ice. And I say the only time that I was really out in the snow and ice was when I was driving a jeep, taking food to a forward platoon. Christmas Day, we were in a place called Ohain, which I'm not sure whether it's in Belgium or in Holland, but on the edge of either place. And we thought that we would be in that village on Christmas Day. Well, we'd had about 4 days there. We were living in homes with families, and we were really enjoying ourselves. And the padre decided that we would give a concert and entertain some of the children in the village. And there was a village hall there, and we made all arrangements to use the village hall on Christmas Day. But on Christmas Eve, we had a message from Brigade saying that we got to move into the Ardennes, and so we didn't have any Christmas dinner. We lost out on Christmas Day. We started going into the Ardennes on kangaroos, which was Sherman tanks without a turret, and the roads were so icy and virtually impassable. After about an hour on these tanks, we had to dismount, and they said that we'd have to wait for wheel vehicles which had got chains on, and that they would take us into the Ardennes. Well, we waited, I would think, for 3 or 4 hours in the bitterly cold weather. Eventually, some troop-carrying vehicles came along, and they then transported us into the Ardennes. We went through Namur, and I say we dismounted at Marsh. Well, of course, there again, we would take over farm buildings chiefly. If we came across a big house, we would probably accommodate that. But most of the time, we were in farm buildings, or in the just depending on what the situation was. We were very often dug in slit trenches, and of course, when we were in a slit trench, you didn't have much opportunity to have any sleep. 2 of you would be in a slit trench. One would be on guard. The other one would crouch down. The only protection we got from the dampness of the side of the slit trench was a gas escape, and after an hour or so, you're glad to stand up, and your mate would take your position by trying to get a little bit of sleep. But we virtually went without sleep. The only cover we ever had over the top was if we were in an area long enough, chiefly in Holland, where digging was quite easy, a lot of sand in Holland, and we would go down deep enough, and if there was any doors or anything available in buildings close by, we would rip the doors off, make a roof of doors or corrugated iron, cover that with some of the soil that we dug out, and make ourselves a little shelter. On Christmas Day, 1945, we were detailed to go into the Ardennes, where the Battle of the Bulge, and the Americans are having a very rough time there, and we were sent into the Ardennes to. Well, really, I think to relieve the 52nd Battalion, which were already in action in the Ardennes. We went into a place called Marsh. That was at the end of December. It was all snow and ice at the time. And after about a fortnight there, we left the Ardennes and came back into Holland again. During my time in the Ardennes, I was jeep driving, and one of my tasks was to take food up to a forward platoon. Most of the forest was mined, and the pioneers or the engineers, someone had made a track through the forest so that I could drive the jeep through the forest to this forward platoon. It wasn't at all easy because they'd marked the track with white tape with a background of snow. Didn't show up very well. So I used to drive my left hand, it was a left-hand drive jeep, left hand running along the tape and just steering with the right hand. Take the food to the forward platoon, and the shelling was quite heavy at that time. used to return with any casualties, take them back, and then I did this about 10 o'clock at night, and then again about 4 o'clock in the morning I would do a return journey, take more food up to them, bring the empty containers back and any casualties, and that was my task while we were in the Ardennes. After the Ardennes, I say we went back into Holland, and eventually we went into the Reuschwald forest. The Reuschwald forest was quite an experience. We went in, I think it was on February the 8th. The 53rd Welsh Division, it comprised of a Welsh regiment, a Highland regiment, and the Oxon and Bucks Light Infantry. We went into the forest. Montgomery thought that it would be the ideal time. Normally in February, the frost would be very severe, and the Reuschwald would be, I wouldn't say easy, but it would be accessible with vehicles. Unfortunately, it started raining, and it rained for, I would think, 3 or 4 days, just continuous. And we were virtually up to our knees in mud and water. Supplies were almost impossible to get through. If it hadn't been for a little vehicle which was called a weasel, it wasn't made of armour plating. It looked a little bit like a small Bren gun carrier, but it got very wide tracks, and that was able to negotiate the mud and water, and that was the only way that we received food and supplies of ammunition. We were in the Reuschwald forest for about a fortnight. After we got to the other side of the Reuschwald forest, that including crossing the Siegfried line, which was no trouble at all, because the shelling had been so heavy. But before we went into the Reuschwald, we had about 4.5 hours of shelling by the 25 painters, and we were nearly deaf when we went in. And of course that really cleared the way for us. Well, after the Reuschwald forest, we were then virtually in Germany, and we pushed on up to the Rhine. We crossed the River Rhine on a pontoon bridge, and then carried on through various skirmishes in Germany. I might add that once we got into Germany, it was a different war for us altogether. When we were in France and Belgium and Holland, we were greeted, and the civilian population were glad to see us. But once we got into Germany, the Germans weren't so pleased to see us. But never mind, we pressed on, and eventually we arrived in Hamburg. Fortunately for us, Hamburg was declared an open city, and so we were spared any fighting, and we went into Hamburg on troop-carrying vehicles. It was a most unusual sight. We entered Hamburg through a big housing area. It was chiefly flats, and lots of the people there had hung out white sheets, and the streets were deserted. And as we passed into Hamburg, we went by the dock area, which had been knocked about very much, and we eventually were in another area, which was a block of flats. We stayed in Hamburg only a few days. We didn't really celebrate the end of the war there. I think we were all so glad that it was over, and we were actually lost for words. After Hamburg, we went down into the Ruhr Valley, at Leverkusen. We went out of the 53rd Division and into the Desert Rats. And after Leverkusen and Langenfeld, one or two more places in the Ruhr Valley, we went up through Hanover to Berlin. And our task at Berlin was guarding Rudolf Hess, who was a prisoner of war in Spandau at that time. And that was really where I had my demob from. I came home on leave in January 1946 and never returned. I had a Class B release, and I was actually released from the army in April 1946. Yes, I think the interest has grown. Of course, the veterans have got a little bit less because we're all getting a bit old in the tooth now, and we keep on losing veterans. In fact, I was at a veteran service last week, at a funeral service. But the interest, I think, it has grown family-wise more. It has in my case. My family are very interested in all what happens in Normandy, and they're very interested in what happened during the Second World War. Which is good. I'm very glad that the younger generation are interested. It's like 10 years ago, my son-in-law, he did the walk 65 miles from Tarrant Rushden to Pegasus. I helped him raise money, because that was the idea of the walk, to raise money to buy or pay for the memorial stones for the gliders which took part in taking Pegasus Bridge. And the stones, the memorial stones at Pegasus, have all the names, including the pilots, of each glider, which is rather nice. Not normally memorial stones are memorials or memories of those who passed away, but these have the complete contents of each glider. Well, thank you, Richard, for this opportunity of speaking. I hope what I've said will prove beneficial to not I won't say to you, but to all who might have the opportunity of hearing it and seeing something of the pictures on the camera. Thank you very much indeed, and it's been a delight to meet you.
weather may be wet or fine, we'll just run along without a care.